He knocked until my chest vibrated, and then he whispered my name. This is one of those sentences you expect to find in a horror movie script, the kind of line that looks good in a thumbnail. But what I'm about to tell you are 3 separate accounts from people who swore, in their own words, that none of it was staged. They were on islands they believed empty. They went looking for quiet or research, and what found them was not what anyone expected. I won't try to explain these events. I will only tell you exactly what they reported, down to the sounds and the choices they made in that moment. You decide what to believe. The first story comes from a young man who booked a cheap cottage on a tiny Maine island to escape the noise of work and life. He asked that I use his name, Leo, when recounting what happened. He told me this took place a few summers ago, when he was burned out and thinking solitude would fix everything. He was not wrong about the solitude. But solitude has its own shape once the sun goes down. He found the listing online, a small, weathered cottage right at the waterline, a place that promised 2 things, silence and the smell of the sea. A co-worker had suggested the island, telling him it was practically abandoned that time of year, that the locals measured their seasons in weekends, and the island's population dropped to near 0 during weekdays. He booked it for a long weekend. He told me he imagined reading and sleeping and not answering emails. Arriving mid-afternoon, the place matched the photos. Grey clapboard, a sagging porch, windows that looked out over a dock and a narrow channel of water. The island itself was generous with empty space. A couple of houses at large distances, a scattering of lawn chairs, a municipal dock with a handwritten schedule for a supply boat. There was a silence to the place that felt complete, not dull, the kind of silence that lets you hear the faraway clink of a buoy. He said the first day was almost soothing. He made coffee, he sat on the porch with a dog-eared paperback, and the ocean kept time. That night things shifted. He remembered the little, ordinary things first. A failing phone battery, he had forgotten his charger, and the last bar of life on the screen winked into overnight blackness. That detail matters to him, and later, when he described the moments that followed, he would return to the dead phone as if it were a starting pistol. With no way to call or to see a map, the island felt smaller and larger at the same time. Smaller because there was nowhere to escape to, larger because the dark could hold more. The cottage had paper-thin walls. He joked about that during the day. Now, in the dark, the joke turned sour. He heard the first set of steps sometime past midnight. Small, deliberate feet on gravel, an audible scrape that slowed at the edge of the porch. He sat up, listening. The sound paused, then it moved. Away, then back, then around the cottage. He pressed his ear to the door and felt the air on his skin. There was a long, patient pause between each step, the kind of spacing that makes you count and then stops you from counting because your fingers begin to tremble. At first, he tried to tell himself it was someone walking the shoreline, maybe a neighbor with a flashlight. Then he saw the beam, thin and steady, slide across the room's curtains, a small, focused light that swept slowly along the cottage's outer wall. The flashlight beam found nothing. It found only the thin curtain and the shadow of the windowsill. He could see the beam from inside, a distant, steady halo inching along. He thought, leave. He thought, call. Neither option worked. His phone was dark. The keys were in his bag on the porch. He crouched behind the back of a heavy chair by the door. One of those silent, desperate decisions people make when they want to be as small and invisible as possible. The person outside tried the handle. The knob clicked against the lock. He pressed himself lower. Then came a bang. Not a soft knock, but a heavy thud against the door. He felt it through the wood, a vibration that traced up his arm and lodged in his ribs. The silhouette of the flashlight shifted. A voice formed outside, near the lock, small and unnervingly patient. It said his name. "I know you're in there, Leo." Short, direct. Not a threat framed as a joke. The way he told it later, the voice had the odd quality of being both impatient and amused, as if someone had a private satisfaction in discovering he wasn't alone. The steps resumed in a slow circle around the cottage, an almost ritual pacing, and then retreated toward the water. He heard a different sound then, the low, settling growl of an outboard motor starting. The beam of the flashlight winked out. The footsteps stopped. For a moment he listened to the motor's steady hum. Then it pulled away across the water and faded like a swallowed animal sound. He spent the rest of the night in that crouch by the door, arms wrapped around his knees, a low ache of adrenaline and nitrogen in his hands. Morning came on a kind of fragile light. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, breath fogging in the air. The gravel showed tracks. Large, heavy boots, deep impressions pressed into the rock and sand near the shoreline. They were oriented away from the dock, following the narrow strip that led to the small cove where the supply boat must anchor. There were no tracks from the neighbor houses, no extra sets of prints from the dock's path, just those heavy boots moving outward toward the channel. He told me he inspected everything he could think of, the locks, the screen, the boards under the windows. Nothing obvious, no sign that anyone had slipped into a window or left other evidence. The only clear thing was the boot prints and the memory of the voice calling his name. When he told his co-worker, the one who had recommended the place, the response was quiet and quick, an exchange of the sort people use when they want to be helpful but also distant. The local bar where he'd stopped on the way back shrugged it off. "People come across all kinds of things on these islands," the bartender said. "Keep your wits." No one offered an explanation. No one suggested that the caller had been a supernatural entity, or a local prankster, or an old man with a boat. They only suggested he be careful if he returned. He didn't return. He left after breakfast. The small ritual of packing and leaving was as ordinary as the trip had been. But the fact of being named, that act of someone knowing his name without having met him on that island, stayed with him. He told me he still dreams sometimes of footsteps circling and the willful patience in the voice outside his door. That's the first account. If you want the rest of the video, more island stories like this, hit subscribe. There are 2 more, and each one gets stranger. The second story comes from a structural engineer who had access to Hashima, the abandoned concrete island off Nagasaki. He described this one as something that happened several years ago during a research trip tied to a conference. Unlike Leo, he wasn't trying to get away. He was there on purpose, permitted, documented, with credentials and a clear purpose. That detail matters because it shifts the atmosphere from trespass to sanctioned access. He told me the date and showed me the faint emails. This was no urban myth. Hashima's history is compact and visible. A dense slab of concrete blocks, stacked and scarred, with stairwells embedded like veins and the skeletons of apartment buildings rising up in abrupt, broken teeth. The island looks, from a distance, like a man-made cliff, the sort of place the ocean collides with and the sun ignores. He and a small team from the conference were led by Tishi, a local fixer assigned to guide researchers through the permitted zones. They were given rules to follow. Stick to the marked paths, do not enter sealed rooms, maintain radio contact. The engineer told me he obeyed those rules the way an engineer obeys a manual. Carefully, with the kind of respect that comes from knowing how fragile structures can be. For hours, the day unfolded as expected, the group moving through corridors of concrete, the sound of shoes on dry rubble, the smell of sea salt and old iron. He took photos, made notes about rebar corrosion and load-bearing walls. Hashima rewarded that attention with detail. A stairwell that wound down into a shadowed courtyard, a corridor whose ceiling had collapsed years before. The authoritative desolation of the place felt like a museum of abandonment, and he moved through it as one moves through a preserved ruin. But then he noticed signs that contradicted the official picture of vacancy. a narrow path of disturbed dust leading into a room that was supposed to be sealed. Where the concrete had settled and blocked a doorway, there were recent smudges, a pattern of fingers, or perhaps a dragging object. There was a patch of warmth on a wall that should have been cold, the kind of warmth that doesn't belong unless someone has been leaning there, or a body has been near. And when he opened a metal locker stacked in a corridor, he found a cluster of flattened plastic bottles and a frayed blanket folded as if someone had slept there recently. He told me plainly that whatever he found there did not feel like relics of the island's past. It felt immediate. It felt like someone had been using the space a week ago, maybe yesterday. That felt impossible. The island was supposed to be regulated. Access was recorded. Yet there it was, evidence that pointed to recent habitation. Tishy's behavior shifted then, in small ways that added up like waves. He had been efficient and slightly brisk, the kind of guide who knows when to keep people moving. Now he became evasive. He reached for the radio and adjusted frequency more often than before, as if listening for something. When the engineer asked him about the blanket and the bottles, Tishy gave a half smile and said, "We don't go in there." When pressed, he said only that some areas were restricted and that they should keep to the path. Later, the engineer would say that it seemed like the guide did not want to look at the evidence he had touched. They kept walking. That is a small, yet important detail. Boundaries are often enforced by small refusals. A guide's glance, a tightened jaw, the subtle steering of footsteps. When they entered a narrow stairwell, the engineer heard behind him a faint scrape, and then a rhythmic sequence of steps that suggested more than one set of movement. He and a colleague turned, counting 3, 4, maybe 5 people moving somewhere above them. On Hashima, sounds carry in strange ways. Concrete amplifies and secrets glide through corridors, like slow animals. He moved faster, a sensible response. Tishy urged them on, but then, without warning, the exit they had intended to use was blocked. Rubble had been shifted deliberately to make the stair impassable. Concrete chunks and twisted rods were piled in a way that suggested they had been pushed from above. Panic is often misnamed. He wouldn't use that word at first. He described the feeling as urgent professional discomfort, something akin to being in a building you realize you miscalculated. He checked the radio. The signal was faint. His teammates' voices crackled. He turned to find Tishy looking past him, toward a corridor that vanished into shadow. The guide's hand tightened on his pack. Then the engineer heard another set of steps, this time faster and closer. There are moments you rehearse without meaning to. In his account, the engineer reached for the rubble and tried to move it. Empty hands on heavy concrete, impossible leverage. The steps behind, now definitely multiple, slid into a rhythm like a pursuing animal. He started to run down a corridor he had meant to examine more carefully, his shoes throwing up dust. The corridor split. He chose one path and then, half a minute later, realized his teammates were not beside him. The sound of movement that had been behind him the whole time threaded through the walls. The distinct pattern of more than one person, both following and choosing their distance, as if trying to coordinate. He ran toward daylight. When he burst into the open, he saw Tishy standing at the edge of the ruin, inexplicably calm, radio in hand. The guide waved him over and said, "This way." The engineer later insisted that Tishy's face held something like indifference. Not the blankness of someone shocked, but the small, contained patience of a person who has seen this before and decided not to be involved. On the boat back to the mainland, the engineer tried to ask Tishy questions, but the guide gave clipped answers and at one point turned off his radio entirely. After the trip, the engineer tried to contact Dr. Yamamoto, the person who had arranged the special access and provided credentials. At first, Yamamoto was responsive, brief emails confirming safe arrival and interest in the preliminary notes. Then slowly the trail went cold, messages went unanswered, calls pinged and then returned to voicemail. Months later, the engineer said he checked public records and found no formal report of unauthorized inhabitants that matched his experience. He followed up with the university and with the conference organizers, who treated the presence of the blankets and bottles as anomalies that deserved a note, but not apparently an investigation. The engineer left Hashima with photos and with a sense of something unresolved clinging to him. Those are the essentials of what he told me: permit, guide, the sealed room with warmth, the evidence that someone had been living in a place that was supposed to be closed, and a guide who acted as if he preferred not to get involved. He described the sound that followed him through corridors as countless feet choosing whether to close in. He left with questions about who was living there, and why the people whose job it was to manage access either didn't see or didn't report it in the way he'd expect. I asked him if he thought it was locals squatting, or something else entirely. He hesitated. "I don't know," he said. "There are people who survive in weird ways. But whatever it was, it didn't feel like a bunch of trespassers making camp. It felt organized, patient." He emailed me a few photos. A corridor with a wet patch on the concrete, a blanket soiled and folded, a cluster of empty water bottles lined neatly against a wall. The grain of the photographs only made the scenes more ambiguous. They were evidence, not explanation. That's where his account left things when he first told it. But the story doesn't stop there. After that day, he tried several times to follow up with Dr. Yamamoto, to connect the dots and to push for an inquiry into the signs of habitation. Dr. Yamamoto's replies dwindled and then stopped. The guide's radio calls faded into silence. The engineer was left with a set of images and an anxiety that settled behind his eyes. The idea of someone moving inside an island that was supposed to be empty, someone who knew the corridors as well as the official keepers did, someone who could block exits as if to choose who left and who stayed. He asked me to emphasize one small sensory detail: the smell in the sealed room. It was a mixture of stale smoke and a kind of iron tang that he could not place. He said it felt like a body, but then corrected himself. He had no right to name what he smelled. He would only tell me it was too immediate to be old. It hinted at life. It hinted at recent occupation. That is the particular kind of terror this island produced. Physical traces that could be measured and yet could not be accounted for within bureaucratic records and guided tours. I'm going to pause the Hashima story there and pick up a few more threads. But first, this is one of those moments I want to remind you of something important. This account involved sanctioned research access. It was not illegal. When people go to these places for study, there are protocols and permits. The presence the engineer reported did not come with a neat explanation. That ambiguity is the hallmark of the stories in this video. They have facts and they have feelings. They have little physical things, blankets, bottles, boot prints, and then an emotional residue that doesn't tidy itself away. At the end of that research day, the engineer told me he had the immediate reflexive urge to go back in and look for answers. He didn't. He told himself later there were too many variables: safety, the risk of provoking unknown people, the professional need not to endanger others. Instead, he documented what he could, sent the notes, and waited for the institutional machinery to respond. He found it unresponsive in a way that felt deliberate. That's where I will leave Hashima for now. But before we move on to the third island, a New York City outpost that is less distant in miles but more remote in its atmosphere, I want to linger on one small shared note between the first two stories. Both men, Leo and the engineer, told me about being named in some way. Leo had his name called at midnight. The engineer, in the shadowed corridors, felt as if the island knew where to place its pressure. These are the texture lines that stitch these accounts together. Islands that should be empty, but are not. Evidence that someone else has been there recently, and a silence that hides footsteps. The third story is different in setting, but carries the same strain of unease. It's a college story, an illicit trip at night to North Brother Island in the East River. It's about separation, mimicry, and a sound you think belongs to someone you love. If the Hashima account is about guided access and frustrating bureaucracy, the North Brother story is about trespass, adrenaline, and the way a voice can become a weapon. This next confession comes from a student who was working on a thesis about abandoned institutional architecture. He and two friends, Jansen and Jesse, decided to kayak after midnight to North Brother Island. They knew it was off limits. This was an unauthorized trip. The narrator told me that fact with a clear voice. They had broken the rules. They had chosen the risk. He emphasized that he isn't asking for sympathy for that choice. He's only being honest about the conditions under which what followed happened. The night they chose was still in a way that makes a person reckless. The city skyline behind them was a band of light. The river moved dark and cold. They landed at an unsecured shore and pulled their kayaks up. North Brother, in daylight, is all rust and broken institutional wings. At night it converts into the sort of place that borrows its own theatre lighting from the moon. They split up to cover more ground, an idiotic but understandable decision in the sort of group that thinks fear can be managed by division. He went with Jansen toward the old hospital wing. Jesse took a path along the water toward the laundry building. The island's sounds are how it gives itself away. Metal complaining in the wind, a corrugated roof settling, the soft thump of distant pigeons. He told me he felt that odd, wide loneliness islands have, the feeling of being in a big, empty object that listens. They were moving quietly when he heard Jesse call. It was a short, ordinary call, better than a shout, less than a yell, asking where they wanted to meet. The narrator expected to hear Jesse's voice return to them from the other side of the complex, to catch that familiar cadence that made him recognize his friend in a crowded hall. Instead, the timing didn't fit. Jesse's voice seemed to be in the wrong place. It sounded closer than it should have been. The narrator remembers the instant confusion, the way your brain latches onto the familiar and then realizes it's misaligned with what your eyes reveal. When he followed the voice down a narrow corridor into a small, dimly lit room, he found something that stopped his breath. There was a very tall figure, standing with its back to him, facing the wall. It wasn't moving. The room smelled of dust and that old institutional cleaner, sterile and chemical, and the figure's silhouette seemed wrong for a human. The narrator said he could not tell, in that brief flicker, whether it was a person in a coat, a statue, or something shaped like a person but not made of flesh. He screamed. He later called that scream an instinctive, pure noise, no conscious plan, only the body's insistence that it was in danger. The sound drew the figure's attention in a way that made the narrator regret having exposed himself. He bolted out of the room and ran until he found Jansen and Jesse in the courtyard. They were both pale, and Jesse's shoulders were trembling. He claimed he had not called, that his voice was with the others the whole time. But then, as they hustled back toward the kayaks, there was a sound that broke something loose inside the narrator. A faint moaning from the dark, like an old woman's breath turned into a sound. It was too perfect. It mimicked timbre and pitch. It mimicked cadence. It sounded like a voice trained to imitate, like someone who had listened carefully to Jesse's laugh and practiced it in the dark until it matched. These are the moments where the sensible thing is to go and the cowardly thing to run. Both options are decisions with consequences. They chose to leave. They pushed their kayaks into the water and straddled them like people trying to forget. The narrator told me they never went back. He said that what stayed, months later, wasn't a fear of the island as a place, but a memory of hearing his friend's voice in a way that wasn't his. That imitation, he said, was precise enough to make a person second-guess everything they thought they knew about the human voice. I'm stopping here for now, in the space where all three accounts are still fresh and open. We've heard the cottage voice that called a name on a deserted shore, the sealed warmth and the neat bottles in a permitted research space, the thin, perfect mimicry that turned a friend's voice into a lure. Each story leaves the door ajar with questions that refuse to close. Who was on those islands at night? How did they move without being noticed during the day? Why did guides refuse to get involved? And why did permissions and official responses evaporate into silence? In all three accounts, the same small elements recur. A sound that shouldn't have been there, a sign of habitation where there shouldn't be people, and the subtle help or indifference of locals and authorities. None of the narrators claim certainty. None offer conclusively supernatural answers. They give us instead the raw geometry of fear. Footsteps in the dark, a radio going silent, the exact syllables of a name whispered through a door. If you want me to finish the Hashima story, what happened after the engineer burst into daylight and what he did next, subscribe and stick around. In the next segment, we'll pick up the guide's disappearing act, the blocked stairwell, and the engineer's attempts to get answers that led him to dead ends. For now, consider this. Islands are supposed to be simple. Their land surrounded by water, and yet, when night descends, the simple becomes porous. The edges move. Voices travel in ways they shouldn't. People and motions that make sense on the mainland don't behave on an island. They reveal new rules, rules that the people who walk these islands at night seem to know very well. There are more details to Hashima and the New York story that will push these ideas further. But before we go on, remember that these are eyewitness accounts, real people, real senses, real questions, no definitive answers, only the sound of footsteps that won't stop echoing in memory. He told me the thing that stuck with him wasn't just the blocked stairwell or the bottles. It was the way the island kept moving around him, as if it rearranged itself to preserve a secret. After he burst into daylight and found Tishi waiting with that calm face, the engineer's account moves into a sequence of small frustrations that built into a larger unease. They left the island on the scheduled boat. The boat ride back was quiet, in the way of people who have narrowly missed something and are not yet sure what they escaped from. Tishi sat forward, elbows on his knees, radio silent at his side. The engineer asked practical questions. Who else had permission that day? When was the last scheduled maintenance? Had anyone filed a report about squatting? Tishi offered answers only in fragments. "We notify," he said. "We check." He did not volunteer the phrase the engineer wanted to hear. "We found them." Instead, he looked away at the water, like a man who had practiced looking at the sea and not speaking of what it reflects. The engineer insisted he send photos and notes to Dr. Yamamoto. He did, with the professionalism of someone who thinks documentation is the safest response to irregularity. The first replies were brisk, affirming receipt, suggesting a follow-up meeting when the research team returned home. Then the messages thinned. A week later, one reply, "Thank you, we will review." After that, silence. He tried other channels. He called the conference organizers. He wrote to the university liaison. He even contacted the agency that manages access to Hashima. He said it felt, in the months that followed, like knocking on doors that were always just slightly ajar, never fully closed, never welcoming. Officials acknowledged his messages but offered no investigation. The island's custodianship, as reported back to him in bureaucratic language, admitted the possibility of unauthorized presence but attached it to a harmless explanation. People camping, fishermen, records error. The engineer said those responses were inadequate. He had seen the warmth on the wall. He had held a blanket that smelled of smoke and something iron. He had stood where footprints indicated recent movement. And he kept thinking about how someone could live within a grid of concrete while remaining invisible to the people whose job it was to know that grid. Months later, he revisited the photographs on his hard drive and found the images had accumulated their own small, stubborn power. In one corridor, a dark smear along the lower wall looked, at first glance, like shadow. Uploaded and enlarged, it suggested the pattern of hands dragging along a surface. Another frame showed a line of bottles placed against a corner, their caps aligned. Another photograph caught a fragment of torn fabric tucked into a seam. Taken together, none of this proved a narrative. Taken together, they built the sense of a presence that preferred not to be seen, but was careful to leave traces that somebody with a trained eye would notice. He told me he replayed the day in slow motion in his head, the way someone rereads an unfamiliar language until a word becomes less foreign. He could not reconcile Tishi's indifference with the abruptness of the blocked stairwell. He said the pile of rubble could have been the result of decayed concrete sliding into a stairwell, natural collapse in a building pushed to its limits by time and weather. But the pile had been arranged, stacked, not random, and the movement of footsteps in the corridor had been deliberate, as if multiple bodies were coordinating to herd them in a certain direction. What scared him most was the idea of someone who knew the island better than the people who managed access. An inhabitant who could move in the interstices, below patrols, above schedules, beside the quiet of sanctioned research. Someone who could sleep where the guide would not look and build small domesticities, blankets, bottles, an internal logic of survival inside an official vacuum. The engineer told me he considered returning under a different pretext. He thought about going back with a team of colleagues, with uniforms, with hardware. He pictured confronting a small group of squatters and asking them, plainly, who they were. But every scenario ended with too many unknowns: safety, legal consequences, the ethics of disturbing someone who might have no other shelter. He imagined the possibility that others had chosen Hashima because they had nowhere else. He imagined the moral complications of searching them out. He chose restraint, and restraint left him with a dry, patient anger, the kind that sits under the ribs and refuses to be resolved. There was another detail he asked me to include, one that he found embarrassing to admit. He woke at odd hours for weeks after the trip, convinced he heard footsteps in the halls of his apartment building. Once, late at night, he crept to the window and looked down at the street, expecting to see a silhouette reappearing in the world, someone who had followed him home. The street was empty. He could not say whether the impression of footsteps was fear or guilt, or the mind's attempt to map danger onto domestic space where none existed. He only knew it made him more vigilant and less willing to shrug off anomalies the way he used to. He never got a substantive answer from Dr. Yamamoto. The contact's silence felt like a crease in a paper map, an area intentionally left blank. The engineer suspected, without proof, that some conversations had been held behind closed doors and that institutional priorities had overridden the instinct to investigate. He tried once to get scholarly attention for the evidence, an email to a journal, a query on a forum where preservationists trade notes. He received some sympathetic responses from people who had worked on similar sites, but none who could offer a clear explanation. The pattern repeated: observation without resolution, evidence without public reckoning, a place that swallowed accountability. When we spoke, he kept returning to one sensory detail, the warmth on the wall. It was, for him, the most human trace of all. It wasn't cold concrete, he told me. It was like a hand had recently been there, like someone had pressed their palm to the surface and left a message that wasn't words. He said he could not shake that physical memory, that particular temperature that suggested a body had been there while the island pretended to be empty. That, he felt, was the most troubling thing. The island's ability to be two things at once, officially managed and privately lived in. A museum of abandonment for tourists and a shelter for people whose stories were intentionally omitted from public records. He wanted an answer. He didn't get one. Now imagine being the sort of person who studies structures to understand how they die. Imagine leaving with photographs and measurements and nothing that sums to a conclusion. That is the engineer's ending, a folder of evidence, an unanswered email chain, and a quiet return to normal work that never entirely erased the feeling of being watched along the seams of a once sterile map. He wrote to me one last thing. In the months after, he would sometimes imagine the island as a body with veils. Some were official tapestries, tour guides, schedules, permit stamps. Others were membrane-thin, places someone could slip behind at night and prefer to remain. He did not know who the people were, who lived there, if indeed they were people, and he refused to speculate beyond what he saw. The best he could do was catalogue and remember. The rest was a silence that pressed like a lid. The engineer's story is a reminder that evidence and explanation are not the same. For him, the physical tokens of habitation, bottles, a blanket, a warm patch of wall, mattered because they refused to be categorized. Bureaucracy could file papers and close cases on its own timeline, but the texture of those objects kept returning to him at odd hours. We move now, back to that city island, to the night when a voice stopped being an anchor and became something that could mislead you. The college student's account. Remember, an unauthorized trip, midnight kayak, an island under the skyline, picks up with a detail he had not expected to carry, the exactness of the imitation. After they escaped, the narrator said he spent months replaying that moaning sound in his head, trying to decide whether it was an old woman's wail, a machine's echo, or somebody practicing an older voice. He admitted bluntly that his conviction about the mimicry hardened with every retelling. The voice he heard matched Jesse's tone in a way that made him doubt the reliability of his own senses. He told me how the group's nerves frayed in different ways. Jansen became curt. He stopped going on late-night walks and began checking his phone for messages at odd hours. Jesse, the friend whose voice had been imitated, took the matter in stride, but grew quieter during conversations, as if listening for some other Jesse anywhere a voice might rise. The narrator admitted to being both fascinated and frightened by the precision of that imitation. It was not a sloppy mimic. It wasn't a prankster trying to get a laugh. It had a patience, as if the unknown party on the island had spent time learning how Jesse sounded in the exact way a person learns a ritual. The tall figure he glimpsed in the room, the silhouette facing the wall, remained an unresolved element. He could not say whether it was a human being standing very straight, a statue placed to startle trespassers, or something else arranged to produce an effect. When he screamed, the figure turned, but by the time he fled, it had become nothing more than a memory of a wrong proportion. Too tall, too still, the angle of the shoulders wrong. In the courtyard, Jesse swore he had not called. The narrator believed him. The group did not split up again after that. The adrenaline of being on an illegal trip had been replaced by a quiet, joint decision to leave. On the way off the island, as they pushed their kayaks back into the water, the narrator remembers the city looming like an indifferent chorus. He remembers the wet slap of paddles and the effort to focus on strokes rather than sound. They were close enough to hear the distant traffic, but the noise felt like it belonged to another world. In that in-between space, the mimic sound came once more, thin and half-hidden among the creaks of the night. A moan that matched in cadence and pitch, a laugh Jesse might make. It wasn't loud. It wasn't an accusation. It was an imitation-turned weapon. The familiarity of a voice used to draw people into a space that was not safe. Once they reached shore and the night felt definitively behind them, the narrator says they spoke in disjointed fragments. They didn't post about it. They didn't call the police, partly because they had trespassed. They didn't want to complicate the story with their own wrongdoing. So the island's secret remained with them, like salt in their teeth. Over the following months, the narrator found the experience lodged as a question in day-to-day life. He would be in class, and suddenly the sound of someone's footsteps would startle him. He would hear a voice in a crowded room, and for a prick of an instant, think it belonged to Jesse when it did not. He said this was the cognitive residue of hearing an imitation perfect enough to stage doubt. He began to view voices as not entirely trustworthy, as objects that might be borrowed by someone else to eerie ends. I asked if they ever played the scenario back, if they had tried to record the sound the next time they went near the island, or if they had attempted to recreate the conditions for analysis. He bristled at the question. "We were kids," he said. "Stupid kids. We could have gone back, but we chose not to. It felt like tempting whatever did that. It felt like asking a predator to show itself again, just so we could prove it." He emphasized he wasn't being brave. He was being practical in the only way available to a group that had broken the law and then seen something they could not explain. That choice to leave and the memory of the mimicry persisted. He told me he sometimes hears Jesse's voice somewhere out of place, a grocery store, a late-night radio segment, and that there is a jolt that is not fear, but mistrust, a recalibration of what a voice can be. He said it altered his relationships in small ways. He hesitated before trusting auditory cues. He learned to look for faces, not just rely on the sound. I wanted to know whether anyone else had reported mimicry on North Brother. He had not heard of any similar cases. He assumed, perhaps naively, that if the island held someone with such a talent, they would have been noticed before. But then he circled back to the power of secrecy on islands, the way permission slips and patrol schedules create gaps, and admitted that people slipping into those slivers of time could be skilled at moving unseen. The tall figure, the voice, the moan like an old woman. Those images and sounds did not translate into a tidy explanation, and so they kept returning to the narrator as fragments that refused to assemble. He did not claim a supernatural cause. He offered instead the memory of being tricked by a sound so intimate that it made him distrust the familiar. After we collected these accounts, each narrator asked for something small, for their stories to be told without embellishment, to preserve the oddness without converting it into myth. Leo wanted the fact that he had been named to remain the thing that mattered. The engineer wanted people to see the photographs and understand how physical clues can be overlooked. The student wanted listeners to feel the confusion an imitation can create. When I stepped back and placed the three accounts side by side, patterns emerged that were more meaningful than any single anecdote. Each one begins in a different mode, seeking solitude, conducting research, breaking the rules. Each island is geographically distinct. Maine's tiny coastal cottage, Hashima's concrete mass off Nagasaki, North Brother's institutional ruins under the city's glare. Yet their textures converge. First the sound, footsteps, knocks, voices. Each story hinges on audition, the sense that someone else is moving in the margins. Sound in these contexts behaves differently than on the mainland. It travels, it magnifies. A whispered name carries farther than it should. A moan morphs into a laugh. An imitation becomes a lure. The narrators all described a moment when the ear convinced the mind of a presence the eye could not confirm. Second, the evidence of habitation where there ought to be none. In Maine, heavy boot prints and a voice that seemed to know a name. In Hashima, a warm patch on a sealed wall, bottles and a blanket carefully arranged. On North Brother, the figure in the room and the voice that wasn't supposed to be there. These are small domestic clues that function like fingerprints. They anchor the unknown to a human scale. They tell us someone was there. They refuse to be neat. Third, the people whose job it is to know. Guides, locals, officials often respond with a kind of practiced evasion. The bartender told Leo only to take care. Tishi looked away and turned off his radio. Dr. Yamamoto stopped replying. The college students accepted that they had no moral high ground to demand an investigation. That pattern, People who stand between witnesses and answers, who offer procedural phrases instead of follow-through, adds another layer to the mystery. It creates a feeling that certain places have a way of being willfully opaque. Fourth, the aftermath. Unresolved questions, recurring dreams, changed behaviors. None of the narrators found closure. None reported a tidy, conclusive follow-up. Instead, each came away with a memory that altered the way they move through the world. Leo sleeps with the idea of footsteps circling his bed. The engineer keeps a folder of photos and an irritation at institutional silence. The student hears voices differently now, suspicious of imitation. These are the human costs, less sensational than a headline, but more enduring. There are a few things I will not do here. I will not turn these accounts into proof of anything beyond the testimonies themselves. I will not invent dramatic deaths or label the encounters as unequivocally supernatural. I will not accuse named people of malice. I will, however, report what was told to me. Sensory details, decisions the witnesses made, and the lingering uncertainty that followed. If you find these stories unsettling, that's by design. Not because they are meant to frighten for entertainment, but because they are thin-veiled reminders of how little we know about the edges of our maps. Islands are simple topographical statements, land surrounded by water. But at night they become things with borders that bend, and those borders sometimes conceal motion and motive. What should you do with this information? Nothing dramatic. Consider it a cautionary thought. Respect restrictions, avoid trespass, treat evidence with care, and take institutional silence for what it often is, an absence of action, not an answer. And maybe, when you are in a place you think is empty, listen carefully. Not to confirm a story, but to honor the possibility that someone else may be moving through the intervals of your certainty. Before we finish, one last detail each narrator insisted on, that their fear was never simple terror for terror's sake. It was a layered emotion, curiosity, professional duty, youthful risk, and then a residual unease that didn't allow them to shrug off what they'd heard. They wanted listeners to understand that the most unnerving thing about being named, or hearing a perfect imitation, or finding a blanket in a sealed room, is the way those small facts force you to confront the possibility that someone else has the ability to slip into your quiet and rearrange it. So here are the three images that stuck with them. A flashlight beam moving along a curtain as a voice says, "I know you're in there, Leo." A hand-warm patch on a concrete wall, and a neatly folded blanket tucked in a corridor where official records say no one should be, and a thin, practiced moan that sounded like a friend's laugh and convinced a group of students to leave an island and never go back. I will leave you with one small, final thought, a sentence I kept returning to as I compiled these accounts. It's not advice, it's an observation, an image. When islands are quiet, they are not always empty. Sometimes their silence is the sound of someone learning how to live in the spaces other people use for ruin. Sometimes the names they speak are real, and sometimes they are imitations so perfect they break your trust in what familiarity sounds like. Which of these three stories chilled you the most? Tell me in the comments below. If you want more true island stories and eyewitness accounts like these, subscribe for the next upload and share this video with someone who loves late-night mysteries. Thank you for listening, and keep your ears open the next time you hear a name called from a place where no one should be.